Hey, hello guys, welcome to the next lesson. We are learning about the trigonometry in the level P3, okay? So that's going to the first part about the big picture, okay? So here we are talking about for our form, the solving the equations and compound angles, and also like turn into the quadratic problems, prove identities problem, and also for the last multiple angle formulas, okay? So we last move to the first part about the R forms. Okay, so here we can set for A cosine x plus B sine x. Okay, so for this part, we were first trying to rethink about for the trigonometry we learned in P1, right? So in the pure math one, we learned about for a rule that is called sine x minus y, and you're trying to expand it, it will becomes to sine x cosine y, and then plus negative the cosine x sine y, right? Okay, that is how to expand it, right? Okay, so also we have the cosine x rule. So for example, like cosine x plus or minus y can be considered as cosine x cosine y minus plus sine x sine y, right? Okay, so right now, if we have A cosine x plus B sine x, so we can just consider if we turn A and B into the like here is cosine, here is sine, and then you can use in the cosine rules, right? If here is sine and here is cosine, we can use in the sine rule, okay? So for example, like here, if we just extract a square root a squared plus b squared, it will become into a divided by square root a squared plus b squared, right? Times cosine x. And then b will be considered into b over square root a squared plus b squared, right? That is for the sine x, okay? So then we can say here, this and this, if you're just trying to consider it as a and b, you'll find a squared plus b squared equals to 1, right? Because a over square root a squared plus b squared, and then plus b over square root a squared plus b squared, that the addition is 1, right? That because it's a squared over a squared plus b squared plus b squared a squared plus b squared equal to 1, right? So we already know that for a sine function like sine squared plus cosine squared always equals to 1, right? So that we can consider A and B. So if you considered A as sine alpha, so for example, A is sine alpha and B is cosine alpha. So the original formula will becomes into square root A squared plus B squared, then times the sine alpha times cosine x plus cosine alpha sine x, right? Okay, so then we can just calculate it as like square root a squared plus b squared, then times sine alpha plus x, okay? That is it. And if you just consider this as the cosine alpha and this is sine alpha, and will becomes into square root a squared plus b squared. So that will becomes into the cosine alpha plus x, okay? That is, oh, sorry, alpha minus x, okay? That is how we consider here. Okay, that is it. So here we can just consider R means we just extract a square root a squared plus b squared, okay? And times alpha, that means how we can calculate the exact value of the alpha, okay? That is how we consider about R form right here, okay? So also we have example like here, if you want to just consider it as R times cosine x plus a or x plus alpha, we can say here, we can first extract a square root a squared plus b squared, right? So here, this is a, this is b, so we can just consider square root 2 squared plus square root 5 squared, that is square root 7, right? So we can just put out a square root 7, and it will becomes into square root 2 over 7 cosine x, and minus square root 5 over 7 sine x, right? Okay, so we can just consider this as a cosine alpha, right? So it will become square root 7 cosine alpha cosine x, and here is for sine alpha, because we said square root 2 over 7 squared plus square root 5 over 7 squared, their addition equals to 1, right? So they can be considered as here is minus sine alpha sine x, okay? That is it. So for this kind of equation, we can say, okay, so the value here is square root 7, and here is for cosine alpha plus x, right? Cosine alpha plus x, because it's cosine, cosine, and minus sine, sine, okay? That is how we can turn to this form. So we can say here, the r equals to square root 7, right? R equals to square root 7. And here, we can say alpha here can be considered as tangent alpha equals to the sine alpha over cosine alpha, that is square root 5 over square root 2, that is square root 5 over 2, okay? That is how we calculate for this problem. Okay, that is for this part. And also another equation, like if we want to just trying to make simplify it a little bit, we can first extract as square root 7, and then it will become into square root 2 over 7 cosine 2 theta minus the square root 5 over 7, and then times sine 2 theta, okay? Then it comes to square root 7 cosine 2 theta plus alpha, and equals to 1. And then you can just written that as cosine 2 theta plus alpha equals to 1 over square root 7, okay? That is how we calculate this kind of problems, okay? Okay, sure. That is our lesson. Hope you can truly understanding for how to simplify the trigonometric functions. Okay, so before we haven't learned about this, so today I hope you can do more exercises and trying to understand it totally, okay? That was our lesson. See you next time. Bye.